And some of the comments I've had back have said, this is brilliant, there's been a lot going on, but I want to go to everything. And I'm afraid you're having to make the choice. I've forced you to make the choice with a lot of the sessions. But what we've got to round this up is a great panel of colleagues from a number of different points on the food system, within the food system. And it will be really interesting to hear their thoughts on some of the things that have arisen today, to pull together some of the threads we've been talking about, we've been exploring, and to think about how we have to work across sectors, across disciplines, to address those intractable problems which we've touched on, which Rob made clear right at the beginning. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to hear 5 minutes from each of the panelists, and then they're going to come together as a panel, and we're going to explore some of those in more detail. It'll be question and answer. I've got quite a few questions I want to ask myself, but really it's up to you. If you have specific questions which you're going to which you want to find out about, then please do put up your hand. There'll be a roving microphone with which to ask those questions. So let me introduce our panel. Beth, nearest to me, is Head of Agricultural Advice at the Soil Association Exchange. She's a farmer herself, and her particular interests are in understanding and advocating for the efficient and complementary use of land, resource protection, and market creation for ecosystem services. Khan, next to her, is a sustainability specialist at Corn Foods. She works with manufacturing partners and suppliers to analyse their sustainability plans, and with others within the company to embed sustainability into production development and the decision-making process. Next to her is Clara, who's the mission manager for Healthy Life mission at Nesta. She's worked in building fairer food environments in retail, community, and residential settings with communities experiencing deprivation. She was named one of the world's top 100 change makers by The Big Issue. That's quite a claim. Dr. Laura Barden, at the end, is a research scientist at the Quadram Institute in Norwich. She focuses on producing evidence to influence the development of policies that promote more sustainable diets in the UK, whilst ensuring that nutritional status of the population is maintained and even improved, particularly amongst the most vulnerable groups in our society. So a great panel with many different facets and different approaches and different positions, which I hope will help to inform the conversation. With that, Beth, do you want to go first?
Yeah. Do you want me behind here?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Right, good afternoon. It's great to see so many people who have hung on for this one. No pressure. So, yeah, I mean, a bit about me to start with and a bit about the new role that I'm doing. Firstly, I have been really fortunate to always work in agriculture and agricultural advice. I'm a past UEA student, so shout out to Brian. I don't know where he is. There you are. Inspirational in soil science and definitely influential in my work, where my work's gone. Always been environmental in soils. My key interest, my happy place is digging a soil pit and counting earthworms. And also I studied environmental economics as well at UEA with Brett Day, who again, those two subjects together has essentially formed the direction of travel that I've taken. I farm, as Phil said, with my husband in West Essex. We have both an arable section of the farm, but also we run cattle. That's quite a new enterprise for us. And we also run sheep as well within the rotation. So we have herbal A's paid for through countryside stewardship and quite going into the SFI scheme at the moment, which is a new way of funding practices which are add a bit more resilience into the system, we hope. In terms of my advice focus, like I say, I've worked in environmental agricultural advice for about 15 years. My previous job was for ag chemical company, and then I've I was there for about 10, 12 years, and then I recently joined the Soil Association Exchange, so very much a bit of a culture change, as you can imagine. In terms of my focus on environmental advice, it's always been on building resilience in farming, which has been really interesting. I've seen all sorts of farms, predominantly conventional, and really that extension of vision on farm around moving away from annual yield and into long-term profitability and resilience has been kind of my mantra, I guess, and like my ground truthing. Am I giving the right advice? Is this going to add resilience on farm? Yes, it is. Let's go for it. And so I'm really interested to hear everything that's happened today, because I'm really impressed with how much has been talked around the producer end, which I was really surprised about, wasn't expecting it. Thought I was going to be kind of a single voice, but obviously I really enjoyed James's speech this morning, and that was brilliant to hear, so thank you for that. So on to my new role, which I've only been doing for about 4 months, so I'm very new, but I thought it'd be interesting to kind of touch on what drew me into the Soil Association Exchange. Those that you know, Soil Association, that's an organic brand, whereas the Exchange is all farming, so conventional predominantly actually at the moment, but we do work with all sectors of farming to benchmark and score farmers on their outcomes and their impacts on nature, on carbon. So we have 6 impact areas: soil, water, carbon, animal health and welfare. This is where I start going off piste. Did I say soil? Yes, that's my favourite. Did I mention that? Yeah. And there was one other, wasn't there? Oh, social. And actually, that's something that I really enjoyed hearing about today. A bit of validation, really, because we really struggle to benchmark farms on the social aspect of farming. And actually, it's something we're looking to improve on significantly. At the moment, it's really just about land access that we score at the moment, but we're really interested in this movement into sort of more regenerative practices and different ways of adding resilience on farm, and how that makes farmers feel, and being more control of their destiny almost, I guess, was really interesting to us. So we kind of have loads of different measures that we would love to have in the metric that we're designing, but we have to make sure that the science behind those metrics are really robust, and I think that's why I've come along today, because I was really interested to hear what's going on in terms of research and where we should be looking for the future of the Soil Association Exchange. Like I say, the thing that drew me in was this outcome focused of resilience on farm, and rather than a set of standards that you might find with something like organic farming or other standards you might find in red tractor assurance, things like that, I loved the fact that it was very much collecting primary data on farm and having a score assigned to that, and then something we can work towards, both looking backwards on farm, say, what do we need to do to improve, but also helping us to make decisions in terms of what are the quick wins we can change to really improve our outcomes on farms. Specifically for today, like I mentioned, we are really keen on making sure our benchmarks are based on robust science, and we review our methodology of doing that every year. We're currently in are in infancy, really. So we're doing our 2nd scientific review at the moment of our methodology about how and what we measure. So that's, again, if there's any interest in the room and wanting to read that, it's only 127 pages, and it's a good one to have before bed. In terms of how we measure it, I just wanted to give you a quick brief on my last minute or so, in that we have like a dual relationship on farm. We send both a technician out onto farm to collect primary data, so it's not based on purely satellite imagery or satellite data, which that goes down really well with farmers, as you can imagine. We actually send an actual person out on farm to go and collect soil samples, do earthworm counts, look at the structure of the soil. We do water samples, we do biodiversity checks, we do bird counts, as well as hedgerow assessments, just to give you a flavour of the sort of thing we're looking at. And then from that, we score the farm, and then we actually send sort of an expert advisor out to kind of go through those scores and to give some really bespoke recommendations as to how the farmer could improve, or what they're doing already that's fantastic and to carry on with. And also, importantly, join it up with some sort of financial reward in terms of whether that is public funded money, whether it comes to the SFI, the Sustainable Farming Incentive, which is this new pot of money that's been released recently, or perhaps there's marketing options for them. So at home at the moment, we have a contract with a company called Wild Farm Grain. I don't know if anyone's come across them. If anyone's a 90s raver like me, you might have come across Groove Armada, who Andy Cotto was part of that group, and he's actually driving the Wild Farm Grain initiative, really, in terms of properly remunerating farmers for not only producing food but also looking after the environment, adding biodiversity, plant diversity into the system. So that sort of thing I'm like super interested in terms of both the nutritional side of that new way of working, in terms of adding biodiversity into a wheat field, but also that element of paying farmers fairly, which again we've heard a lot about today, which I'm super pleased about. But also maybe we're just going from, in terms of this financial reward bit, it might just be around cost savings in terms of finding efficiencies in the system to, again, help to build that resilience, reduce reliance on potentially artificial inputs that might not be necessary, and also have that sense of self-sufficiency. So yeah, I hope that gives you a bit of a flavour about me and what I'm up to. That's it.
Thanks very much, Beth. And that begins to give a flavour of some of the things we want to explore, such as, moving from conventional farming to organic farming, how they can learn from each other, what the issues they face in moving across that is. Khan, can I draw on you next to come and talk about your work?
Good afternoon, everyone. Don't know if you can hear me from the back. Perfect, thank you. So a little bit about me. I'm Khan Mat. I'm the sustainability specialist at Quorn Foods, and my job is like looking after the environmental impacts of our product portfolio. If you may know, we have corn products made from mycoprotein, and we have corn products as well. So all in the same family, and that is plant-based brand. And not just about product carbon footprint, I also work with our colleagues to see how we can embed sustainability into product development, like how to help our packaging team making a better decision when they choose a new packaging format. And on top of that, we also want to bring sustainability closer to consumer and customers. Like, people care about sustainability, but sometimes they need to make it, like businesses like us, we would love to make it easier for people to understand and see like the impact that they can make to this world with just a change in the diet. And I also support the business in terms of the modern slavery statement, and that is something that I'm super passionate about. And today I'm here to talk with you just a little bit about sustainability and why we should, and why we should, okay, this one. Is it better now? Oops. Sorry. So I'm just talking a little bit about sustainability in the food system, why we should care about that. And I kind of like, oops, I have a clash with Rob earlier because he already talked about that and he prepared that in less than 24 hours. I feel so much pressure after knowing that thing. So let's take a step back. Like, why should we care about sustainability and why the food system should care about it? We've heard about that so much today. A third of the global carbon emissions is actually from the food industry. And then 70% of fresh water is used for farming, for agriculture. But at the same time, 40% of the food that we produce every day never comes to consumers. And as you may know, like we have loads of issues, like concern regarding the society, such as like climate migration, such as food insecurity, and so on and so on. And in a nutshell, it's just like we should care about sustainability, about nature, about the climate, about biodiversity, because if there's no nature, there will be no food. And if there's no more food, there will be no more life. And I was like, oh, what's this woman doing here at this time of the day, too long, and then talking about miserable things. But I promise you, there's always the light at the end of the tunnel. And the light here is that just a change in our diet can actually benefit the environment. So if you have heard of this, the National Food Strategy has suggested a cut down around 30% in red meat consumption and eating more vegetables and fresh fruit, and that will help and that is the change that we need to make in the next 10 years to help the UK reach our target in climate, in nature, and in also like the health issue as well. And besides that, the Eat Well Guide by Public Health England and One Blue Dot by BDI has suggested that we should have more, similarly, we should cut down on red meat and have more plant-based protein or fungi protein, as well as more vegetables and fruit. And also the Carbon Trust has proven that if we follow the diet suggested by Eat Well Guide, we will have a lower impact on the environment compared to the current diet that most of us are following in the UK. So it means that they're actually a solution to this whole issue, and alternative proteins and vegetables can be part of that solution. And if we zoom in a little bit more into fungi protein, let's say, how many of you here have heard of corn foods and have ever tried corn products? Ooh, my company will love this. Next question, how many of us here know what corn is actually made from? Still really good, honestly. So we made from mycoprotein, and mycoprotein, as you may know, like it's grown from a fungus called Fusarium. And how do we make from fungus into called mycoprotein? So the fungus is grown in the huge 40-meter high fermenters in our site. And that actually makes it a very land-light protein. So we can scale it with low land impact. And also we have done some research to prove that corn mycoprotein has actually also a lower environmental impact in terms of land, water, and carbon footprint compared to some animal protein. For example, if we compare with beef, then the producing mycoprotein would be like lower than 90% lower in terms of carbon emissions, in terms of land footprint and water footprint. And not just that, it's not like, okay, it's good for the environment, but is it good for my health? Then we have worked with academia to prove that mycoprotein is low in saturated fat, containing zero cholesterol, and it's good for gut health, and also it's effectively to grow your muscles, just as animal protein. So all of that to say that a healthy diet doesn't come with any kind of compromises here. So a healthy diet can be good for your health and at the same time good for the health of the planet as well. And yes, we have said that so many times today. The food system is broken, but at the same time, I am a strong believer in collaboration, because I can see that if each of us in the food supply chain take action, if we try to work hard and more importantly work together, we can solve this issue. Thank you.
Great. So collaboration, absolutely, that's key to what we're here today to do. Can I call on you, Clara?
Hello, my name's Clara, and I'm a mission manager in the Healthy Life mission at Nesta. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit very briefly. Well, I'm going to try and be brief. I've got about 20 minutes worth of material here, but Laura's promised to wave angrily at me when I get to 5 minutes. So I'm going to speak very quickly, but fortunately I'm very caffeinated, so this should go well. So our Healthy Life mission at Nesta seeks to increase the number of years lived in good health for everybody in the country, particularly those who are most impacted by health inequalities. And our primary focus is on food environment redesign in order to do that. It's widely accepted that systems approaches should be adopted when trying to change the obesogenic environment, but that so far hasn't really happened. So Dolly Van Tullochen and Martin White at the University of Cambridge did some research to look at government strategies over a 30-year period of about 700 policies, the high majority of them focused in on individual behaviour change. And as Rob said today, people are under multiple constraints, making it almost impossible for them to operate outside of the default system. I did have to go through my notes and write, as Rob said multiple times over. So thank you, Rob, for such a comprehensive keynote speech. So not only does that approach create a stigmatizing belief that obesity is an individual's fault, but it also has failed, and excess weight in this country affects 35 million adults. To quote even a friend of mine, Professor Jaap Siddel, who works on the Amsterdam healthy weight approach, obesity is a very normal response to a very abnormal environment. So in a severe crisis underpinned by complex factors, we're way beyond silver bullet thinking, and we're also beyond confetti thinking, the idea that we deploy lots of isolated interventions over a system and we see what sticks. On average, we consume about 195 calories extra than we need per day, which is about the equivalent of a packet of crisps. So we don't really need a revolution, although I'm by no means against one. But what we do need is a really joined up approach between policies and interventions that help us make small and sustainable changes. And I call this the spaghetti approach. So the spaghetti approach recognises the importance of how interventions target different leverage points in a system across the many layers that a system incorporates. And it does that in order to develop cumulative impact. It values the complementary nature of interventions and also collective moves forward, paying attention to combined feedback loops and also emergent outcomes. Likewise, a spaghetti approach also really values the space in between the interventions, and that's often around relationships and investment in infrastructure. So Alex today was talking about the cluster, and it's very much in line with the cluster: investment into networks, investment into communities of practice. So Nesta is exploring the impact of a wide range of interventions that target everything from the way that our food is made to the information that consumers get about it. And this system-wide approach really requires multi-stakeholder engagement and commitment across industry, academia, consumers, health advocacy groups, politicians, policymakers, and everyone in between. We do this by taking radical new approaches. So we harness unique disciplines: data science, design, technology, arts and culture, behavioural science, collective intelligence, and research to develop multidisciplinary projects that seek to generate fresh thinking and novel solutions. So to give you a couple of ideas of what that looks like, our Citizen Social Science project involved young people aged 13 to 16 across the country, and we got them participating in generating new data about digital marketing of unhealthy foods to them. We used a gamified crowdsourcing method to help retain their engagement over the process of the project. We asked them to identify unhealthy marketing, screenshot it, and upload it to a particular system. And that data that they collected for us contributes to a growing data set around what young people experience in the digital world and how policy can keep up with that. Another project is that alongside game developers, we experimented with video games that support policymakers to understand the implications of policies around healthy eating and obesity prevention. This is like a sandbox environment where policies can be played with, speculative futures can be developed, and we can rapidly test interventions and try to understand what their impact might be. So one of the parts of the brief today was just to talk about some of the challenges we face. So despite mounting evidence of how important a systemic approach is, 95% of the British public still thinks that the onus is on the individual to remain healthy, despite all the evidence that it's near impossible in our food system. So what we need to do at the very beginning of this mission is to forge a new narrative. In the models that exist to identify leverage points in a system, all of the models point towards underlying mental models or underlying beliefs as the foundation of the way that we view and the way that we talk about a system. And so, for example, in Meadows' 12 Points to Intervene, she identifies those existing mental models as the foundation upon which all systems are built. And the sorts of myths that we sometimes hear, the sorts of mental models that we sometimes use and discuss at present are things like, well, people should be able to have a treat in their diet. Well, yes, absolutely, people should be able to have a treat. The problem is that we have a food industry that's targeting that segment of the market and that segment only, because that's where there's money to be made. Other things we hear are consumers vote with their wallets. Well, that's not true, as Rob said, that sales, we have a fifth of the population who aren't able to purchase the food they need. And in the cost of living crisis, we have many people changing the retail environments that they shop in, changing the way they shop, changing the products that they buy. And therefore, sales no longer reflect demand, if indeed they ever did. So by reorientating and re-establishing our myths and our shared beliefs around the food system, this enables us to then redirect the goals of the food system and direct them towards those core beliefs that we share at the University of Kent, at the Food Foundation, that have come up again and again today, around making healthier food the default choice, making healthier food the less expensive choice. And we need to proactively broaden that conversation around bringing people, extending our kitchen table, bringing people around to have that discussion around what we want those goals to be. And I've had some brilliant conversations with Helen today and with others in the room around how we do that, how we make an inclusive conversation that involves everybody at the table around what we want our food system to look like and what we want it to achieve. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Clara. Confetti and spaghetti. That's two things to bear in mind. Laura, over to you. Oh, yes, slides. They're up there, I think. Sorry.
My emotional support slides. That's me, pardon, is it?
That's it. There we go.
Sorry, am I loud enough without the mic? I usually am. So yeah, I have prepared a few slides just to keep myself on time. And sorry, I'll start. So as Phil said, my name is Laura Barden and I'm a research scientist working in food policy at the Quadram Institute for Bioscience in Norwich. And we are the Food and Nutrition National Bioscience Research Infrastructure in the UK. So my role, as I said, deals entirely with food policy. I am relatively new to the role. I'm only in it about 5 months. And I suppose the aim of what we're trying to achieve here is try and influence the development and evidence for new policies that are aimed at more sustainable food consumption within the UK, whilst also making sure that nutrition is maintained within our population and in many cases improved, as we know we're not doing fantastically at the moment. We know there are many nutritional problems ranging from obesity, non-communicable diseases, and then we also have a lot of, I suppose, more hidden nutritional issues such as undernutrition, whether it be micronutrient inadequacies, older adults not achieving enough protein, and those kind of things. So for the focus of what I'm going to talk about now are the opportunities and challenges that are presented to us in the food system as it stands at the moment, and then the future of what we can do to work together to move forwards. So being optimistic, we'll start with opportunities. So I think there's a huge amount of opportunities, as we've heard throughout today and from the work that's ongoing across loads of different sectors, for us really to come together and develop a whole new food system or transform the food system we have through development of new food products where they're focused on alternative proteins, where they're focused on more micronutrient dense foods, more smaller food production from smaller farms. And if we do these things, that there is a great opportunity to actually reduce obesity and other non-communicable diseases in this country. For example, we know that we don't eat enough fibre as a population. So if we start to shift towards a more plant-based diet, there is huge opportunity there that we can, as a consequence, reduce obesity prevalence and also reduce development of certain types of colon cancers and stuff from having a better diet. And improving nutritional status, if we start to focus more on increased consumption of fruits and vegetables, reducing the reliance on saturated fats and on processed meats and those kind of foods. There's also huge opportunity going forward through interdisciplinary collaboration. We've heard today from the range of different people that are here. We need to collaborate more amongst from our different silos. I think we all tend to focus on our own area where it needs more joined up thinking to approach this from a food systems approach and to revolutionise the food system that we have. We need people who are working in agriculture to work with people, nutritionists to work with industry for the development of these new products. all across the food chain. That's the only way we can actually have an impact, is by working together. On the flip side, we also have a lot of challenges that we're up against. We know we have this transition, that we need to transition towards a more plant-based diet, a more sustainable diet. But within that, we need to consider our full population. There are certain subgroups that we know are not already not achieving nutritionally what they need to. For example, our older adults. Protein becomes a bigger issue, that they're higher risk of developing things like sarcopenia. We know that we have a lot of pregnant women or children that are not achieving the iron requirements that they need. Are these issues going to be aggravated as we move towards a more plant-based diet? And we need to make sure our messaging is clear around that. We also need to be very conscious of socially what could happen as we start to transition towards a more plant-based diet. We need to be aware that cost goes up. It is more expensive to eat a more healthy diet, and that we don't want to widen that gap of food insecurity between those in our country who are least deprived and those who have the most money. We also need to consider things like nutrient bioavailability. There are loads of new products on the market, and there's loads of alternatives to more animal-based foods that are coming out there. Is the iron absorption the same? Is the zinc absorption the same? And we need to make sure that we have enough research out there in order to support this, and to know that we're not going to create issues further down the line. Then finally, I have the unknown. We actually don't know what a transformed food system would fully look like. We don't know what, if we radically change the diet of the population, what that would look like. And with that presents both opportunities and challenges, as we've talked about above. Then finally, moving forward to the future of the food system, and what do I think that looks like? So as I said, we need more stakeholder engagement. We need to be able to approach things from a multidisciplinary point of view. And I think only from then can we have true impact, that we can engage with politicians, we can engage with policymakers to have a real impact, that we can present to them a full case of, if we do X, Y, and Z, this can have a real impact on a range of different areas. We need to continue to generate evidence, as I said, for public health policies. Our messaging around subgroups of the population, whether that be pregnant women, older people, teenagers, needs to be consistent, it needs to be clear. So for that, we need to have more modelling studies. We need to see what, if we look at the population now, we need to monitor their intake and continue to monitor the UK population dietary intake, which we do through the National Diet and Nutrition Survey. You know, if we suddenly change to 30% of the population changes to a vegan diet, what does that look like, and what are the consequences and the opportunities within that? We need to engage more with industry and with food producers to create new products and to reformulate products we have. And we have had some fantastic successes through policies such as the sugar tax on sugar sweetened beverages, where it has had an impact and it has reduced sugar consumption in the population. So I'll leave that there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Well, thank you all for those initial thoughts, those ideas, those questions that you've raised. There's a lot to explore there, and we've got relatively limited time, but I do want to start scratching the surface on some of the things we've talked about. The idea, the need to develop the evidence base, to test out policies, which both Clara and Laura alluded to. The way behaviours or ways of working need to change, which Beth talked about, and the need for collaboration, which Khan talked about. I've got questions, but are there any questions in the audience before we get started? Yes, Sarah. Sorry, could you take the microphone? Thank you.
Thank you. So I would like to, before I ask my question, I would like to make a statement. 10 years ago, the amount of food waste that we had, it was around like 900 million tons. Now it's more than 1.3 billion tons. So, but when we compare the technologies that are available today compared to 10 years ago, like now we have app or software for anything and everything to be able to manage and reduce our food waste. So over the years, what as a researcher, I have noticed that the adoption of such technology is not increasing, but the food waste statistics is increasing like as our population is growing as well. So my question to the panelist is that without using huge amount of marketing budget, what do you think we can do, or what actions we can take to improve the adoption of such technology that are currently available? Thank you.
Any takers initially? Any takers initially before I put someone on the spot? Okay, I'm going to put Clara on the spot.
Does this work? A little bit.
Yeah.
In terms of, food waste. So I've come out of the surplus food industry in a way. My first job in food was with the UK's largest redistributor of surplus food. It's an issue that I've thought of a lot, but usually through the lens of charitable redistribution. In terms of prevention work, so I suppose what's interesting to me is maybe some of the global case studies we have that are emerging from other countries. So France brought in a law particularly targeted at the retail sector, but around the redistribution of surplus food and bringing in penalties for food waste. And, that definitely did drive up the rate of, or drive down the rate of food waste, but also caused some issues in terms of making the charitable sector basically a waste management sector, dumping huge amounts of surplus food, a lot of it not really fit for consumption onto the charitable sector. So I think that's kind of something I would warn against in terms of, yes, we need ways of managing that waste, but we also need to be really thoughtful about how we do that. It's not good enough to sort of say, yes, we're going to lower the levels of waste without having thought through what are those channels. Obviously, prevention is always better than cure, and so I think a lot of the work that thank you. A lot of the work that I would advocate for really is how do we prevent food waste at that retail level, that manufacturing level, and how can you create perhaps penalties for the production of stock that goes to waste rather than catching it at back of store or catching it at a consumer level and going up to upstream levels. But again, as Rob spoke about this morning, there are some really innovative ways of tackling waste as well, and looking at that RAPS waste hierarchy and how we can kind of utilize each of those levels.
Thanks very much. Carla, do you want to?
Yeah. I think, thank you for the question. I would just add to that, actually companies are doing things in terms of this food waste issue, because I know that this food service company, they have a machine and data that they look into, like what kind of food that they usually have to waste after a meal, like usually for example, at a workplace canteen, what kind of food that people don't really like that much, so they've changed the menu. So there are people doing things, and like for example at home we also track the waste, the food waste number at our place, and that helped us to reduce the food waste at our factory level. But I guess there also think about how do we, like we said, like we have the upstream that we need to concern about, but also I believe that a lot of food is wasted at a household level, and it comes with a lot, much more education, even though the UK has done some really good job with the Love Food Hate Waste campaigns, but I believe that education level in terms of food waste still need to be improved much more.
Great. Thank you very much. Other questions? Yeah, over here. Ooh.
Just continuing this discussion around surplus food and kind of drawing on what you just raised about charitable food redistribution. This is kind of partly a statement, partly a question, partly just a general conundrum that I think is a big question that we still are working toward resolving. So especially with food banks and with charitable food redistribution, they serve a really vital role. Nobody can argue that. but looking at long-term system transformation and what we actually want our food system to look like, which is again something that we're not really sure about. There have been criticisms of food banks and charitable food redistribution, like surplus food redistribution in particular, because it's like it could be seen as secondhand food for secondhand people taking away choice. And what role, like, do we really want to be reliant on charities in our food system and for food security? So just in terms of what we actually want to change the system towards being, and long-term, how we balance those kinds of competing things and taking account kind of social good and the agency of people with their food choice. How can we balance that with food waste and this really big issue about all of this edible food being thrown out? So any thoughts on that? I would be really interested in hearing.
Beth, it looks like you're...
Anything to add to that one? I think I'm probably going to be going over this way.
Yeah, I don't want to dominate, but I've got some thoughts that might be interesting. We refer to it working in the sector. So at Nesta, what I look after is I look after our access portfolio, and I've been in food access for about 10 years. And, you know, when I began, we referred to it as social alchemy, like the concept of taking a waste product and turning it into meals, turning it into great food for communities, turning it into energy and supporting communities to utilize that. And I think the charity sector does that, and it still does that. And I don't want to downplay the work they do, the absolute importance of the work they do, and the fact that sometimes, you know, that waste food really, and I've seen it firsthand many times over, the surplus food, the waste food, however you want to frame it, really does make the world of difference to preventing the waste of human life. And that is really important. I think in these sorts of rooms, in these sorts of communities, we can be more ambitious and we can talk about the future of the food system. I think we have to recognise where we are now in the immediate need and actually what we aspire to as a community in the long term. And we need to be able to hold those two conversations at the same time. And there is a tension between those two. And I've had many very lively conversations over the years about those tensions and about the extent to which you prevent long-term systems change by creating an immediate response. And I think you do, but there is always balance to be had. I think in the long term, and this, is Maz still in the room? No. So Maz from Essex Council was here today, and we were talking in the room around the right to food in Kent. And they're opening community supermarkets where they're diversifying their supply chain. So they are looking at surplus food. They're also looking at food donated from allotments. They're also buying food in wholesale from breaks and from other huge providers. I think what's really interesting is that on Megan Blake's community ladder model, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, you know, we've got the food banks right at the bottom rung, and when people fall off that ladder, food banks are usually the best place for them to be in that first rung of them climbing back up again. And we have Aldi and Lidl and the discounters. We also have social supermarkets there in the middle. And I think those social supermarkets, because of the cost of living crisis, because of what's going on, are becoming more important. And so I think we really need to look at that model of, can we provide alternative retail in communities that meets people's needs? And how do we do that? Do we take over convenience stores? Do we utilise pharmacies? I mean, I've had so many weird and wonderful ideas of how we might do this. We've got buses going around. We've got all sorts of niche models emerging. Some of the work that's going on, Sustain are doing a job trying to connect up those niche models, trying to provide that kind of learning across those models. The Trussell Trust are campaigning around the Essentials Guarantee to make sure everybody gets the money they need via the benefit system, via UC. You've got lots of different pockets trying to develop policy around not just preventing people from falling off the ladder, but making sure when they get back on, there are the nutritious, sustainable rungs of food that's made available to them. And in the long term, what I hope we can do is take out that bottom rung, which is the surplus food, which are the food banks, and just make sure that people never fall off the ladder. That's what I hope for.
Great. Thank you very much. Another question over here.
I'll be all right without the mic. So a question for all panellists, but particularly for Laura. You mentioned in terms of the challenges and the potential opportunities, this unknown. and it also came up in yours as well, Clara, that idea of sort of being able to kind of test policies as well. When you talk to policymakers about the unknown and the uncertainties, I wonder to what extent that either helps or hinders the policy-making process, and what the impacts of dealing with that unknown are.
Thanks for the question. That's really interesting. I think when I spoke about the unknown, I mean that before we get to policy level and widespread policy at a national level, we really need to have an understanding of what we want politicians to do and how we want them to do it. I think everyone in the room would agree that we don't want a policy tomorrow saying everyone must go plant-based automatically, because that doesn't meet the needs of the entire population, and we actually don't know what the consequences of that could be. There's also no doubt that we need to move towards a more plant-based model, and that the way we're eating currently is not sustainable. But I suppose where I was going with the point is that we need more evidence. We need to generate more evidence, and we need to do a lot more research. Can you tell I've come from a research background? But at the moment, we're just not there. And that the thinking for so long has been, in these silos where we look at nutrition and eating certain foods and what the impact of that is on certain population groups and on our health. And now we've moved towards what is sustainable nutrition. It's not very well defined as of yet. We have had that the Eat Lancet report where they published the reference diet, and they did give quantities for amounts that we should have from different food groups. And there has been criticisms of that, and we know that it's not fully nutritionally complete for all population groups. So I think where I was going is that we need to be very clear, and that we need to have more evidence first and foremost. Messaging around absolutely that, meat-free Mondays, or, we need to reduce them. I think that's an excellent message. But in terms of public health, before we dive straight in, we need to be clear about what we want and what those consequences are, because we don't want unintended consequences, or we end up with this parallel system where we have, on one end, a lot of obesity, non-communicable diseases, things we have from overconsumption of food, animal-based foods. And then on the other side, we have the complete opposite, where we have an incomplete diet and we have opposite problems with loads of micronutrient deficiencies. I think there's now questions about the bioavailability, as I mentioned, of different nutrients, and that as we move towards our reliance, is there going to be, is there certain nutrients that are going to be inhibited their absorption, that we're going to have more issues with iron and zinc? The conversation around ultra-processed foods has now been added into that on top of sustainability, nutritionally adequate. It's a really complex picture we have at the moment. I think in terms of having a really strong policy, we need to be clear on what we want first. And it was more of a cautionary approach. We do need to act, but we need to be clear on how we're going to act.
Thank you. Further questions? Sorry. Yes. I thought you were putting your hand up, Sylvia.
I have a question.
Sorry, was I going to
Yeah.
Apologies.
The gentleman over there.
Thank you very much. So my question is on the two things. So one is on the childhood obesity, which is part of my PhD, and it's a complex problem, we all agree. And I don't know what kind of evidence you're waiting for, because everything is out there right now. The most deprived areas have higher concentration of fast food restaurants. But then again, my question would be, and that also goes to the problem of food waste. Where is the place of political goodwill in all this? Because some things actually need some political goodwill in terms of policies. I do believe if someone came from another world and asked the British people, do they really love their children? Because if you look at the food environments right now and the problems there, the kids will, probably the kids are the stigma, the kind of, including skeletal development problems, and also the challenges they might have in the future, someone might have in doubt whether the British people really care for the children. So people need to also make some noise, because I don't believe there is much being done. The government, things like sugar tax, things like, because you say very clearly that the onus now is not on the individual. We need to support individuals to make the right decisions. So where is the place of, and just before I forget, the issue of food waste, recently there are consultations and most businesses agreed on mandatory food waste reporting the government, and last minute the government again saying they're not going to implement this. So I do believe there's a place for political goodwill, and this conversation needs to be held also as much as we look at academia and what the industry can do. Thanks.
It's a big question. Political goodwill and loving our children.
I'm a single mum of a young child. I work in the charity sector and I live in London, as you can imagine. Finances are a stretch. Fortunately, we get by just fine and I have a very strong support network. But let me tell you that I've fed my child crap sometimes. Go to Iceland after the nursery run, buy some absolute... Sorry, this is why I'm not allowed to talk to policymakers. Buy some absolute shit. Pizza that has 0 nutrients in it. Because we need to eat. And that is what the budget allows for. That is the walk home that we have. I can't deviate from that walk home. He is of the age, not so much now, but when he was at nursery, he was at the age where we couldn't add an extra 10, 20 minutes onto our journey. He was already falling asleep on the 2 bus rides home that we had, and I would end up carrying him up the hill with the bag of shopping from Iceland. So let me tell you from a lived experience point of view, yes, we love our kids. Absolutely, we love our kids. In fact, what the research shows is that often parents give their children unhealthy food as a treat because they can't afford other treats. They can't give them days out. They can't give them toys. But what they can give them is a bar of chocolate. And they still want to show their children that they love them. And therefore, actually, that food, that treat mechanism that food provides, is part of the way that they show they love them. And I appreciate in the long term, some of us might say, well, that doesn't make any sense. But life in poverty often doesn't make any sense. So I really want to push back on that narrative about not loving our children. I don't think that's the case at all. I think where the political goodwill is it often is around children, because children can't be seen as individual economic actors. They can't be seen to have particularly high individual agency. And therefore, actually, we do, at a political level, have a lot more leverage talking about children and children's food environments than we do with adults. And that's why over at the Food Foundation, they've got the kids' food guarantee and not the people's food guarantee. So I think that's definitely an entry point. But again, for me, it's about that myth busting with policymakers, with the media, really proving some of these myths that we have in the food system, really disproving them. Because a lot of policymakers, so my co-parent also happens to work in this space and does a lot of research around policymakers' perspectives of obesity. And a lot of them, they believe in these myths that exist. And they have the same sorts of views of the food industry around things like individual agency that 95% of the British public do. So I think that's where we need to start, is the mental models and the narratives and changing those and generating more goodwill from that.
Great, thanks very much. Laura.
I was just going to piggyback on what you said there. And first of all, thank you. That was like a perfect example. That when I mentioned from a policy point of view that we need to be quite clear, we know there's too many fast food outlets, and we know that it is an issue in children, that obesity is huge. And it's not just in children, it's across the population. But when you look at making policies, we need to be very careful that we don't introduce, unnecessary taxes for all of a sudden certain foods become unaffordable, and we're widening that gap, and that gap of food insecurity. We've heard earlier in previous sessions that social supermarkets, food banks, they're in high demand now, and we need to be, I suppose, aware of the impact we have, that if we're here looking at this perfect food system and in transforming our health, that we don't have unintended consequences at the other end that really impact on people's lives and impact on people's autonomy and ability to choose and how to eat and to support themselves. So I suppose it's that double-edged sword. You're trying to improve the food system and move towards a fairer, more just environment where it's healthier for all. But you also need to bring everyone along with you, and it's not just a more sustainable, healthy food system for those at the top. And it's raising the floor, not just the ceiling. It has to be both in one.
Great, thank you. Sylvia, did you still want to ask?
Yeah, why not?
You don't have to.
Yes, it was about, this is not a question, it's a kind of a provocation, and it's what you were saying before about the need to be sure to have sufficient evidence that informs policy. You need to be sure what you're doing. And I just finished to read this book by Dimbleby, Ravenous, is the book. and he's been advisor for the National Food Policy, and he was just venting out his frustration in the book about this, about the fact that politicians will always want more evidence, and they cannot have more evidence until they implement a policy that shows that evidence, that produces that evidence. Until then, evidence will never be conclusive. And he suggests another approach, which is quite interesting, and he talks about this case study in, I don't remember if it's in Norway or Finland, I always confuse the two nations, but they had a diet problem in the 50s with the population, very unhealthy, only meat, no fibers, no vegetables, very low consumption of vegetables. And the person in charge of the food policy, rather than adopting a comprehensive and comprehensive food policy, tried several things. So tried several schemes and several programs, sometimes contradictory, but they worked. Some worked, some did not work. And the idea is to run things, because if you don't start, you never get there. And I wonder what is your thought about it, because it contradicts everything, you know, the usual approach, scientific approach, robust science that will inform policy. Again, science and the evidence that we can provide is never conclusive. There will be always something that another study that contradicts the study that comes before. It will be very difficult to have 100% certainty of what you provide as data. Just an idea.
Thank you. I think there's a few things there. So first of all, in terms of, obviously, yes, you're never going to be sure if a policy is going to work, and you're always like, there is never certainty. I think what I meant in needing to be sure is that we need to have studies, particularly, not so much when we talk about obesity and stuff, there's an awful lot of data there. We know that there has been an awful lot of work done, there's an awful lot of research that has worked. There's been a lot of government in action, not just here, but across the world, in implementing policies to tackle, and most have been pretty unsuccessful, as we can see from the data for obesity rates over the past decades. But I think when we move into sustainability, it is a new area. And I think that there is so many, it's so multifaceted. It's not just a nutrition thing. It's not just an agriculture thing. It's, you know, it's the whole food system. There's a huge amount of different areas that go with that. So I think when we talk to policymakers and when we look at going to government looking for change, it needs to be a very collective and joined up approach. We need to come at it from all angles. And I also think we need to sell it to them, and that we need to take on responsibility, that we need to build a business case for this transformed food system. You know, there is a certain responsibility as scientists or people working in the area in general that, you know, this is our data, this is what it shows. You need to turn it around then and be like, and this is why it's important. It's possible to turn it into cost benefits, which, you know, that's what sells, that's what, you know, that's what works. Sorry, I'm trying to think, was there something else I was going to say there? Yeah, sorry, talked a lot.
Okay, time for one more question. Brian, over there.
Thank you. Brian Reid from UBA. Nice to see you again there.
Hiya.
Okay, this might engage all of the panel. So my question is, what influence or perturbation might, or will the acceleration of natural capital assets influence the food sector, for the better or for worse? So I'm thinking kind of around, you know, biodiversity cognizant production, sort of gold standard at produce, net zero food as defined by the carbon offset or carbon insetting to achieve that, and then, you know, enormous food players and the Cargills of the world out there, you know, engagement with natural capital assets will change and shift the whole dynamic.
Beth, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, as we mentioned a few times today, in terms of siloing, I think is really important in this narrative. In that we've got to make sure that we look. It's not a simple. There's not a simple answer to any of this in terms of, you know. I think there's a real strong issue with focusing on things like carbon offsetting on its own, and we've seen that just from the very small amount of time I've spent with this industry in the current role I'm in. when we look at just carbon, there are issues with that. So I think when we're talking about natural capital, and it's got to be economically viable to get involved in that market, and it's got to lead towards that north point around nutritious food production and allowing farmers to do that. So it's not about necessarily let's get involved in this, that and the other. It's a case of that north point, does that answer that question, ground truth it, does that lead to a sustainable future, like long-term resilience? I would try and move away from the word sustainable, because do we really want to sustain, or do we want to move forward and change things? We want a sustainable profitability, we want that for long term, but we also need to add benefit and add diversification into the system, and I think this is where natural capital assets come into it. If it allows farmers and agriculture to provide nutritious food in the future, great. If it's going to hold up a business which is not viable and carrying on in the same respect and sustaining, then we need to be careful with that, is my opinion.
Okay, I think that's an excellent point to end on. Covered an awful lot of ground, not only in the panel, but over the course of the day. And I just would like to say thank you to the panel for such an interesting discussion about some of those issues. Only scratching the surface, but it's been really helpful to start to scratch the surface. So thank you all for taking part.